men are much less likely to come to therapy than women, much less likely to become therapists than women. Men have some unique needs and issues that could be addressed in therapy. And a lot of times men are scared away. And I think some of that is due to, maybe inaccurate stigma around therapy. But some of it is due to, I think there's this feeling in the field where as a man, your primary problem is you need to acknowledge your privilege and tone down your masculinity. I feel, is there some holes where we're missing where we could serve men better?
Well, let me ask you this. In your training, because I graduated from grad school in 98, so I've been out of school a long time. Have you had any classes on working with men effectively?
None.
Okay, either did I. And good luck finding one in any graduate program, right? I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge is, I have a saying in just my own little field. I say therapy was not designed for boys, and it absolutely was not designed for boys with ADHD. The child and adolescent mental health field is 90% female, and that number is growing. It's not getting better. So is that a problem in itself? No, but what is a problem is that we completely ignore the needs of boys and men. And there is this expectation that their brains should work exactly like adult females, and they should be able to, verbally express their emotions and benefit from therapy the same way that an adult female would. And I think right there is the genesis of the problem, is that therapy, it does not acknowledge that boys and men have different, the mental health field doesn't acknowledge that boys and men have different needs, and on top of that, I also think there's a very anti-male bias in the field. Back in, I think it was 2019, the APA came out with guidelines for working with boys and men. And, if you want to talk about something that was, ideologically captured as a document, it was that. I mean, it was extremely negative.
That I think seeking mental health is often viewed as weak, or that there must be something wrong with you. And I think that that is obviously still a thing that I think men, struggle to get over.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's just kind of a broad misattunement in the way the field is branded and presented to men. What I would say to men around mental health issues is that social emotional skill is going to be absolutely essential to anything you want to do in the modern world. You can't be a leader in anything without very strong social emotional skills. You need them to be a CEO. You need them to start a business. You need them to do whatever you want to do. Social emotional skill is pretty important. And so part of that is being aware of what you feel and why, and what other people feel and why, and how those interpersonal patterns are reproducing, so that you can understand them and speak candidly and directly about them when needed, and you can assertively and constructively respond to problems. These are absolutely essential things to being a man. And it's going to be helpful for dating, helpful for relationships, helpful for being a dad, everything that you do, you need high social emotional intelligence.
The anti-male bias is well described on your channel, but I mean, I just could say there's so many ways that is true. For example, we think of sadness and vulnerability as good, but we don't think of like acting with humor or acting with action in response to distress as like coping the same way. So there may be a bias in how we think of what is good coping or good responding.
I do talk about therapy. It's similar to education, where similar disparity of men versus women, where 80% of therapists are women, about 80% of teachers are also women. And what I'm pushing is that, does that lead to learning environments and therapeutic environments that are more suitable to boys learning, so girls learning, and women's therapeutic needs? And I think there's a strong argument that it does. So at least part of the reason why boys are behind in education is because education is designed by women and for girls more often. Similarly, the reason why so few men go to therapy is because therapy is more suited to women's needs, because it's mostly women that are offering therapy. So these are conversations that are really interesting, and people desperately want to have them.
I think that there's a tendency amongst some men these days, I think, to see therapy as this warm, cozy, supportive, validating sort of endeavor. And that may not speak to what men want or need out of therapy. I think that some men want and need something that doesn't fit very well with that, without that type of conception of therapy where we're just warm and validating and supportive. I think some men are much more interested in understanding themselves more fully, maybe in a way that aligns with psychodynamic approaches, where they're interested not so much in those relational tones, but more in terms of understanding themselves intellectually.
When we look at men's mental health right now, men are dropping out of education, dropping out of the labor force, a mental illness on the rise, high suicide for men, addiction for men, a lot of rough stuff going on for men's mental health. As a man in this profession, how do you conceptualize what's going on with men today?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with these narratives. Kind of from my view, a more fervent form of feminist narrative has taken root in the field and in the culture at large. Historically, there was this critique that was levied against feminists in the past, let's just say. Male and female feminists alike, oftentimes I think the conflation is made and people think of it as gender specific, but it's a set of beliefs about how the world sets itself out in terms of gender disparities. There used to be this critique that feminism was anti-male. And I think historically that was a unfair diagnosis or a critique for the majority of those who are involved, particularly in first and second wave feminism. When you fast forward to this most recent cultural advent, which I often refer to just as modern wave feminism, you get these narratives that really do sound more anti-male in nature. And you have to wonder, with those ideas being accepted more in the culture of the field, if that will have an impact on clinicians' abilities to work with men and women, male and female clinicians alike. I think what happens in any group dynamic where you get a little bit too much homogeneity is you run the risk of homogenous narratives becoming kind of ubiquitous across the group. And while I certainly have seen men benefit from working with female clinicians, and I think I always will. We do have to take a step back and ask ourselves if that homogeneity has in any way attracted a certain level of error or risk with regards to more intense versions of anti-male rhetoric. And I do think that is something that we should discuss and look into as a field.
Yeah, I think that the past 10 years has been pretty tough for men in the mental health profession. I think there's been, and the emphasis on women were just not part of these conversations a generation ago. So I think it's important that there has been a concerted effort to focus discussions in our society around women, or just generally including women in policy discussions, health discussions, discussions around government programs, policy, and so forth. These discussions aren't zero sum. You can advocate for women and advocate for men. You can be an advocate for masculinity and for femininity. And so I never agree with the framing around toxic masculinity and around sort of gender theory, gender ideology as framing men as or masculinity as something that ought to be destroyed or fundamentally changed.
So we do have 4 male therapists and 1 male therapist in training here. And I want to talk about how therapy is often very coded as feminine. It's kind of understood to be a feminized practice of talking about your feelings and things like that. And this came up to me when Dr. Perin was saying therapy is change. To me, that's a very masculine way of understanding therapy. There's a purpose. There's an outcome that you're shooting for. And if Dr. Perin, if you could put on earmuffs real quick, when I'm talking to my guys in the center and I'm teaching them CBT and DBT, I'm describing it as a shield and a sword that you're taking with you through life into battle. How do we market therapy in more masculine terms so it's not thought of as something like feminine that boys and men don't do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, what's funny is I'm very proud of being here right now, and I'm not joking. I'm honored to be with you guys. And I screen capped this and texted it to my wife, and Heather wrote back, very eclectic group, and I said, bunch of middle-aged white guys. but we're here for men's mental health, right? So I think that a big part of this, and I'm just going to say this and dip out, I think teaching, first of all, is good because it hits the frontal lobe. Teaching neuroscience and the neuroscience of therapy is good because it's curiosity. Men like to figure things out. And so if we can offer something that's clever and creative and has practical, tangible application, like this is what your brain is doing in response to environment, it softens the blow and makes it more inviting. And then we can get into the woo later, like deep psychodynamic stuff and your conscious and your unconscious and your collective unconscious and your introjected beliefs. But it has to start with something concrete because men are concrete. I mean, we love the abstract, we love dreaming, all that stuff, but we also love to wrap our hands around something. What do you think?
Yeah, but there's nothing more concrete than so-and-so reminds you of your mother. You know what I mean? Like that's not super deep or woo.
Totally.
You know, so like transference and countertransference discussions, if you can't talk about those things in concrete ways, you're just stupid or you're uninsightful. One of the two things.
Yeah.
They're not that complicated. And my interns love it when we talk about transference and countertransference because it's practical. It's a practical, logistical thing. Is there a difficulty in the relationship because of how they see you or how you see them or both? Simple, practical. I can't imagine needing to market this to men. Maybe that's a little controversial. I don't think there's anything to market, personally.
I think it's because it's been culturally taken over. That's why it needs to be marketed.
I don't agree with that framing. I think there's nothing to market. Let good people go out there and do good work. They will be found. Competence always rises to the highest possible level. Also, let's keep having public discussions, but I don't think this is marketing. I think this is just five guys talking.
I agree with you. Look, the libertarian in me agrees with you that the market will figure that out, but it takes time. And I think what's happened is the overwhelming representation of therapy is feminine. And you have to have something other than the marketplace, which is dominated by 85% female therapists, to counter that. We have to make a presence. I mean, how? It's been going on. If it were working, more men would go to therapy. They don't. So I think we have to market it. Now, it doesn't have to be billboards in the traditional sense or, social media ads. It could be this, right? Podcasts, Walk the Talk America, Guns and Mental Health podcast. Guns and mental health, those things go together. Yes, they do.
Half of the tweets any of us drop on X.
Yeah, basically. I just think being good examples is the best thing we can do. I don't give a shit about marketing or even trying to help more men. I don't care about that. I think that maybe this is me being Christian or Buddhist or whatever. You can accuse me of whatever, but if I'm doing the right thing, life will get better. And that's all I'm concerned about.
And the irony here, of course, is men have 200% more suicide than women. Men live 7 years less than women. But there's vastly more sex-specific research for women.
I think the problem with the mental health culture currently turns men off. You either get your a-hole guys like Dr. Phil, who are, I like Dr. Phil, but just he's just that you're stupid, kind of thing. And men don't like being called stupid. They don't like that. They get patronized. They get talking down to. It's more of a dad who's yelling at you. Or a mom who's yelling at you. And so I think they either get that or they get the coddling. And they don't like your coddling. They don't like talking about their feelings. Men don't like vulnerability anyway. And so having to come in and just talk about your healing journey, they're give me some practical things. I have a few clients, I have a lot of men on my caseload because I'm a guy. And one of my things I get the most from them is just hey, any homework for the week? Because they want something to do. They want to work. They want to work through it.
Yeah, there's a tremendous problem in this field with this, which is one of my main concerns because, as we know, boys and men are not doing so well right now.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge problem with younger men. It seems like, I do, have historically in the addiction field worked with quite a few younger men. And it seems to be this really tough dichotomy that they run into, where on one side, it's this very emasculated vision presented by feminism, where it's just kind of become another type of woman over here. And on the other side, you've got this very kind of chest-thumping Andrew Tate vision. And a lot of men are very confused as to what actual masculinity looks like. How are you guiding younger men in that minefield?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, in my work that I do with kids, I tend to stay away. I don't want to say I stay away from this, but I tend to stay away from the politicization of it because obviously I don't want to, touch this. I think really the best thing we can do is just model it and talk about that, for instance, on, Sunday when I have my, group, I have a middle school group and a high school group. You know, and when we talk about social anxiety and we talk about, you know, how do guys form friendships and keep friendships and what do other guys need from you? I think to just talk about this in a very matter-of-fact way and not start from this premise of, you know, men are toxic and they can't talk about their feelings, right? And you're going to be different because you're going to be able to verbally express feeling words, you know? I think that we just we do it by modeling it, I think is the answer.
You are a man. You're a man in a female-dominated profession, a minority in the field in that sense. And also, men are much less likely to come to therapy. Like, what do you think is it that makes therapy less appealing to men?
So one of the things that I have successfully been, like, I think probably 70% of my clients are men most of the time. One of the things that I think has made therapy not appealing to men is that it's not action oriented. There's not a solve. There's not what am I working on. It feels like so often to men like they're just spinning their wheels. And you know, I'm talking about something that happened 30 years ago. And and it's not that what happened 30 years ago was not important. It's just not what he wants to focus on at the moment. You know, so maybe if you look at it literally like spinning your wheels, you know, I think some therapists spend so much time working on the engine and the radio and working on all these other things when he's stuck in the mud. Like, let's help him get stuck out of the mud. Once we get that done, then yeah, let's fix the other issues and let's work on that. But I think it just doesn't feel action oriented enough. There's not solved. It's just too touchy feely sometimes. You know, so I always tell clients that it's a much better chance that I'm going to offend you than that I'll make you cry. You know, more likely I'll offend you. And 90% of the time, the guys look at me and say, "Bring it on, man. Let's do it. That's why I'm here. I'm not here for you to tell me that I'm right and that I was justified. I'm here for you to tell me how to fix it and move on."
I think the psychotherapy profession is dealing with issues men and boys face.
Interesting. In my opinion, I personally think the world of psychology is streets ahead compared to the world of counseling and psychotherapy. You know, for example, here we've got the Centre for Male Psychology. There isn't an equivalent within the world of counselling, certainly to the best of my knowledge. There are, I suppose, efforts from the world of counselling to try and help boys and men. In my opinion, I think they often come from a place that is perhaps sometimes a bit patronising to boys and men and implies that they just need to talk and open up and express their emotions. There isn't a lot of acknowledgement of the average differences between what males and females want from therapy. There doesn't seem to be a lot of acknowledgement about that. Within the world of psychology, there is more of that. The British Psychological Society, for example, has their briefing paper, I think it's called, that gives guidance on working with men in therapy. And it kind of really makes good use of good science. It refers to some really credible research and literature around what men on average will want from therapy, whereas the world of counselling doesn't really have anything like that. I get a sense that they're a bit reluctant to do so. So in my experience, they are, you know, I think the world of psychology streets ahead.
You know, switching gears a little bit, you are a man in like the mental health field, and the mental health field in recent years has been heavily female dominated. I don't know how psychiatry is, but definitely therapy has gone that way. Men's mental health has been very poor in recent years and seems like it's getting worse. What can you tell me about why are men kind of lagging behind? If you look at education, labor force participation, mental health, suicide rates, all across the board, there's struggle with men. What's going on there?
Yeah. Wow, that's a great question. And it's a simple question that has a complex answer. I would say there are probably many factors in that, sort of just taking things one by one. I would say in general, men, I think it's always been the case, and maybe even more so nowadays. I do think men are less likely to seek out mental health treatment for various reasons. So I think among a lot of men, you know, there's still this mentality of, no, you got to be tough. You got to just fight through it. You don't want to, asking for help is weak. I still think there's a lot of that out there. And, you know, I think you talk about how the field does seem to be dominated more by females than males. And you do have to wonder, does that, at least for some men, does that deter them from seeking out treatment. Because every person is different, but I can imagine probably a good number of men would like to be treated by another man. And if that's the case, then access is going to be limited. Or is it just that they merely see mental health as sort of a female thing, so to speak? I mean, ultimately, you can't sort of predetermine what sort of individuals enter the field of working in mental health, but it does make you wonder if there would be more benefits in having sort of more men.
Patrick, Dr. Lockwood, I think we work in a similar field, and I'm sure you work with somebody who has just come out of prison and said something along the lines of, I ain't doing no therapy because therapy is for insert feminine slur here. You know what I mean? Like, you have to overcome that obstacle.
No, I don't.
Okay.
Nope.
No, because they're mandated.
Well, I'm kind of coming from a little bit between here because a strong majority of my caseload are male, and a lot of male patients and male clients search me out because I'm male. Kind of that point, we are 24% of the representation in this field. I was hired at 2 VA hospitals because veterans wrote their senators that there were no male clinicians in their mental health clinics.
Sure.
So, like, there are men who are explicitly saying, I want to work with a man. And it's because there are some issues that disproportionately impact men, or there are some issues that they don't want to have to go into some additional detail, and they want to feel understood by someone who has similar experiences. There is a benefit to that. We understand that. If somebody was maybe a victim of sexual assault and their aggressor was a male, they might feel less comfortable working with a male clinician than a female clinician. And if they say that, we'll say, of course, we'll connect you with a female clinician. But we don't actually have the supply to be able to do that for male clinicians, even if patients are asking for it. So I kind of agree with Patrick here.
Closeted.
I agree with Patrick that I don't actually have to market it and say, hey, we need to do man therapy for men that's masculine and male. But I see the demand where men are going, we want therapists, but we want somebody who is maybe a little bit more active, maybe a little bit more firm. We want someone who's going to confront us. We don't want to talk about our feelings. We want to confront or have friction of some kind. People say, I want someone who will challenge me. I want someone who's tough. Sometimes some say, I don't even want a nice therapist. So I think it's a supply and demand issue. There's more demand than there is supply. We don't have to tell them, hey, you should get therapy and you should maybe find a male therapist. They're looking for it. We're not available. There aren't enough of us in graduate school or practicing.
Well, one of the things that I think really does alarm me is the anti-male sentiment. I had an intern today tell me she presented a case and one of her fellow students commented that he was having a mantrum and like that it reminded this therapist of children. And I know that that would not be the case if it was a woman, and this person was just expressing themselves, right? So there is such a tendency to reinforce the male is really bad and inherently toxic.
So I think our current mental health culture turns men off. For the couples therapy, I had a guy just last week tell me, he was like, hey, if I'm a little skeptical, I just want you to know it's because I've had a lot of bad experiences, and every time I come in here with women, it always ends up being just like my fault. And like, I think so it ends up being like they're afraid they're going to pick sides, and as men are a little bit more expressive with their posture and tone, that a lot of therapists will pick on them, I think, and a lot of times men are the problem.
Anti-male bias is everywhere in therapy and psychiatry. Like, if you ever had a patient who had domestic violence, they're not going to be treated as seriously if they're a man.
How does social anxiety manifest differently in younger men compared to women, and why are we not catching it as well?
Yeah, I don't even think it necessarily manifests differently. I think that, at least for kids, that, we don't really talk about it. We don't teach kids about it. So they don't have a frame of reference for understanding what it is. So like for, it's, anxiety in general is very common with ADHD. 30% of individuals with ADHD also meet the criteria for an anxiety diagnosis. Often it's more mild, but, for the kids I work with who have ADHD and social anxiety, nobody's ever explained this to them, so they have no context for understanding it. So they often think they're the only one in the world who feels this way. And my thing is, when we can get, a group of boys or men together and be able to talk about this, and help destigmatize it and help them feel like I'm not the only one, I think that's what's most important. And that's why I will only do groups with kids. I don't do individual, because I think particularly for boys and for young men, having a shared experience of seeing other guys their age who can, show some vulnerability, and it doesn't have to be dramatic vulnerability, right? It can just be like, yeah, I feel anxious sometimes. I think that's really powerful.
Do you feel like in the early days of psychology and psychotherapy, you had people like Sigmund Freud who were just very male, very sex obsessed, everything like that, and in the following 100 years, the pendulum has swung to where it's like incredibly female dominated, and I think we've lost a lot of that masculinity. Do you think the pendulum has swung too hard in the other direction?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what has brought on a lot of the coaches in the world and a lot of people overreacting into that world, where it's therapy has become seen as a soft field and not directive really hard, where I think a lot of coaches are kind of the opposite. They come in and they have advice and they have directives and they have, I need you to do this, this, and this, and I need you to go and buy your wife flowers 3 times this week. And it's much more directive versus touchy-feely. So I think that, I think the field as a whole has followed like much more feminine.
So one of the things that I see from a lot of female therapists is to treat men as though our natural state is that we're kind of like defective women. Like we need to be fixed of our masculinity so that we can be appropriate, which is more like a woman. I observed a female clinician go into a men's group therapy, and just opening question right off the bat is, how has your masculinity hurt you? And I feel like there's just a really, and I don't think it's malicious most of the time, but there's a huge misunderstanding by a feminized field of how to treat men.
So help me understand how it has ever been constructive that we've been able to push a person into loving themselves by better hating a part of them. Like the thing that I grabbed out of my addiction work is we're never going to be able to shame and guilt a person enough to make meaningful change in their life. Well, so if we sit down with men and we essentially say, you are fatalized to not have the relationships you want, the life that you want, based off of things that you absolutely can't control, like whether or not being born with testicles. How do we give that person any hope? And it's not hope. Really what we're doing is we're manufacturing, are you willing to live in this box? Are you willing to live these ways?
There's this conversation around male loneliness, which is a bit of a proxy for male suicide, men's mental health. But apparently the male loneliness epidemic isn't a male loneliness epidemic. It's a skills gap. It's a skills gap. Men don't have the skills to talk about their feelings. This is a self-inflicted problem. And it's, of course, it's down to men to solve themselves. But what I think that conversation misses is that the skills we're teaching men, i.e. talking to each other, maybe those skills aren't what's best for men. Maybe we need to find a new set of skills. Maybe the skills that we keep insisting that men learn are not the right ones. Maybe they're right for women, but not for men. Maybe we should be teaching them how to armor up and fight a Roman battle, or make their steam engines, or walk their dogs, or whatever else it is, go to allotment, blah, 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 blah. But we always insist that men are the ones that are wrong. And yet that might not be the case. And it's, again, like it's frustrating to be on the left, because I spent many years talking about men's spaces that are dominated by men and how they are more suited to men's needs, like certain industries where 80% of board directors are men, so therefore the companies are probably more suitable to men, which I understand. But then we would never talk about the opposite, where therapeutic models or therapists are mostly women. So surely that's going to create systems and frameworks that are more suitable for women. And the sad facts are things like 91% of men who died by suicide in some studies had sought help, and they still took their own life. So if you're looking at suicidal men and more than 9 in 10 of them took their own life, then surely the problem is the help didn't work. Like 91% of them sought help and then killed themselves. So The idea that you then point at the men as a problem when they turned up, or at least 91% of them turned up, and they weren't saved. Surely the finger should at least in part be pointed back at ourselves for failing to give them the appropriate care. And we're just not ready for that conversation because that requires accountability on our behalf, meaning society, and that's just not something that we're ready for.
And then I think lastly, I think the fact that there isn't many male therapists is a turn. I think they want the women. I think they don't want to feel like they're being talked to by their mom. And I think they want well-respected older men in therapy. So I think part of the problem of why men don't go to therapy is because there's not that many male therapists. So, there's probably other reasons, but those are off the top of my head what I can think of.
And you can imagine if you let's imagine a situation where a man sought out mental health treatment, and let's say they worked with a therapist who had this mindset of, let's say they were using these guidelines that you just described, and let's say the therapist is communicating that, these are toxic traits, these are things these are bad things, these are things you need to change. You can imagine that man would probably not have a very good experience, and he would be unlikely to continue that treatment and ever return to treatment. So these sort of attitudes arguably can end up deterring men from seeking treatment they might otherwise benefit from.
I think there are the broad factors and the specific factors, right? So there's the broad societal, institutional factors. So I think there are simple things that might be encouraging men not to come, including like social narratives and social media and all these alternatives, right? So like you heard me say 5 minutes ago that I think 2/3 of people don't need therapy, which would probably include men as well. And so there are people who are influencers and podcasters and even therapists who are like, you don't need therapy, go to the gym. You don't need therapy. Like, this is Wilfred Riley, I think.
Riley, yeah. He's super anti-therapy.
Yeah. So he and I went back and forth about this, and I think it was a pretty good back and forth. But, you've got tons of people who have a platform who say, you don't need therapy, go to the gym. You don't need therapy, talk to your friends more, have more dude time. All of which I agree with, by the way. I think there's a very solid case for a great many people to just go hang out with your friends, or if you're into it, go to church or go to a civic group, go to Kiwanis, go do something to be with people and be of service, and you'll feel better. And I agree with that in so many cases. So I think there's that influence. There's a systemic influence of like influencers and podcasters and whatever it is. I think when people talk about like the influence of graduate school, right? So, there are certain narratives. It's not like a completely institutional thing, but I think that there are subsections, there are pockets in grad psych where masculinity is seen as more bad. Because when things were at like peak woke in the United States in like 2017, 16, whatever it was, there was all this talk about masculinity, privilege, women. Fine, fair enough. So I'll put that on the list of things too.
I think there's been a shift in the past 40 years or so as the field of psychotherapy has become more heavily female. Theories have evolved. And so when psychotherapy was dominated by men, it certainly had its problems. And it probably was far too interested in interpretation and the intellectual game of therapy, making sense of symptoms, delivering in interpretations, analyzing defenses or interpreting defenses. And now, especially in the psychoanalytic world, things are very much have turned in a way that really places much less emphasis on those elements of therapy. And it's more of a feeling endeavor. And I think a lot of men really, they don't want to go into therapy for that type of therapy. That's what's, observed on social media. That's what they get on YouTube and the like. And they just basically conclude this isn't for me. Either I want practical solutions or I want something that's really going to help me understand who I am and why I'm struggling and the like.
I want to piggyback on that because my gateway to enter education, my first job in my agency was as a Head Start behavioral interventionist training school staff on conscious discipline intervention. And I was partially hired because I am male, and there's nobody who's male working in Head Start. And it was the how would I say that? The drought of male healthy relationship was evident as soon as I walked in any Head Start classroom, because I instantly became the jungle gym of the classroom every time,
Mm-hmm.
without fail. And those kids didn't
Nice.
respond to anybody else in our staff that way. I was the only male staff member in
Same.
that role.
Same. We did
Yeah.
work with Head Start for a number of years, and it was the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like they're starving for that. They really, really need, really, really want that.
When I was, because I get my own therapy as well, and I remember I was trying to find a male therapist, and I couldn't find any. The few that I found didn't reply, so I ended up with another female therapist. She's fine, but it's just like I wanted a guy and I couldn't find one.
I'll back to the research that I would love to know. There was a point where it wasn't that way, where it was mostly male driven, or at least the psychologist level was mostly male driven. And I would love to see what a counseling session looked like in the 60s or 50s versus a counseling session in the 2020s. You know, and what that would look like.
Men mistrust therapy. Men mistrust psychiatry because I think there's a tendency, because there's a gender skew towards females, and also because like the APA said that males are inherently toxic, masculinity is inherently toxic. There's like this open misandry in the field, so men run away. They don't want to come and get help, and that's unfortunate.
How can we get more men to come to therapy? Or do we need men to come to therapy?
Great question. I mean, I think that men absolutely can benefit coming into therapy. The number one barrier to entry, I feel like, is men feeling like they're going to sit down and they're just going to hear a regurgitation of the view in front of them, right? To hate themselves. The reason why you're having all these problems is because you like to duck hunt and you have a bass boat and you drive a diesel. Like there's like, you know, you're just raging toxicity, right? Because I'm sorry, I'm innately male. And I think that if we're honest with ourselves, I know you're hearing this from your colleagues as well. Everyone's turning around going, hey, the referrals are drying up. Like the phone's not ringing as much. What's funny is most people are focused on, well, it must be Google ads, it must be a better bio, it must be a better website. I think you have a large segment of the population that's simply telling you, we don't trust you anymore, right? And I don't think that trust would make much sense. If you sit and you pigeonhole people and you tell them that they're a basket of deplorables, and you tell them that they're misogynistic and that they're bigoted and they're backwards, why would they want to go spend any time with you?
If I look at my experience, and I'm just going to talk only about me and nobody else, I don't give a shit about your day or your life. I am not the kind of person who is interested in a story. And so, like, do men care about stories as much as women do? And so my belief, and I don't know if this is correct, but one of my beliefs is that males on average, and maybe this is me being a stereotype or sexist guy, but like, I think men care less about people's stories and more about what they're doing. Like, you know, the stereotype about like people, like relationships, you're married, whatever, like women want to talk about the story and what happened. They don't want you to fix it. Dudes, I'm guilty of this. I want to fix it. I have 5 solutions right now. Why are you still talking?
What I hear from patients is sometimes they say things like, well, look, you know, I have to be either emasculated or I'm considered psychopathic. So I can't just, there's no concept of healthy masculinity, which there obviously is healthy masculinity. But if according to this woke religion, men are inherently toxic, then it's going to be hard for a normal kid who's 15 years old trying to figure out what he's going to be in the world to find healthy masculinity. He's going to either go to the Andrew Tate side of things, or he's going to try to become emasculated. He's going to try to become like a woman and try to be as feminine as possible to fit into the culture. And both of those are bad options for the average guy. I mean, it would be like kind of like asking women to either, you have to tell women you're either going to be stoic or you're going to be pathological. So there's no notion of like healthy femininity either. That would be equally bad for women, but we don't really do that. There's no APA guideline on toxic femininity. You know, there's one on toxic masculinity because of the bias there. So there's so many examples in couples therapy.
So it's not like come into therapy and talk about your feelings and cry about it and be a victim and feel vulnerable or something. I think that's the way that a lot of men fantasize and rightfully so. I think there are people that practice that way, and it's cringe, and it's, you know, I wouldn't encourage it, but it's like, it does happen. But it's like, the reality is a lot of men have, like, you have to be able to be aware of what you feel. I think engage it. Your emotions are also fuel. Their motivation. If it's anxiety, can be fuel. Anger can be fuel. Anger usually is there's a problem that you need to speak up and respond to. You don't need to go out and hurt somebody or do something destructive, but sometimes you're frustrated because there's something you need to speak up about. And that could be a constructive, positive thing that you're addressing a problem. Anxiety, similarly. Sometimes you're anxious because you need to get something done. So use that, you know. So I think, like, it's good to be connected to them. They can strengthen relationships and enrich life and lead to creativity and all kinds of positive stuff. So some type of emotional engagement is good, and it doesn't have to be like, well, how did that make you feel? And are you sad now? Stuff that's like it doesn't need to look that way. And so I think that if therapy was reframed, it could resonate with men better, and make them more willing to engage treatment and get more out of it, because they know what they're doing a little bit. But it's not the way that it's often kind of branded and presented. I think it strikes a lot of men as cringe. It strikes me as cringe a lot of times too. And I think that's probably the central bias. I think there's all kind of other biases against men that we could get into, but that's probably the most important.
And so I think there's been a certain evolution in therapy itself, within the field itself, that has led men to avoid seeking therapy, as well as the fact that it's just plain hard to find a male therapist these days. I have a pretty equal split, men and women, in my practice, but a lot of the men I see me in part because it's impossible to find other male therapists. It's really hard, actually, for some men.
I bet another reason why is they're very afraid of looking at their own shit. I don't think we have a society that incentivizes men to look at themselves. I think we have a society that incentivizes men to criticize themselves, either in a woke way or in a like masculine right-wing way, but not actually have a real relationship with themselves. And so I think there's some cultural norms there too. And then I think there's all the dozens of specific reasons for a particular individual why they might not, as a male, want to do therapy.
I will tell you that, and people will argue with me, I think there's actually a ton of men that are willing to enter into quality therapy services if they can find a quality therapist. Because I'm not struggling for referrals. I'm not like, the phone hasn't stopped for me. The phone is ringing more. The difference, I feel like, is it's very easy to type Adam Luke into Google and look me up. You'll see every podcast I've ever been on. You'll see my website. You'll see my posts, and there's a consistency there. And like I tell people, I just want to be a resource in your life. And that also means that I don't come from the position of arrogance of believing I'm going to save you. I think you and I are going to find the tools necessary for you to save yourself.
What advice or strategies would you offer to a female therapist who is working with young men who are deeply discouraged about life and their opportunities for love, meaning, work, and outlook?
Read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Incredible book. Life is all about perspective. And your life is not that hard. Read that book and you will find out. And you have an option to, what he says in his book is when you can no longer change your circumstances, you're forced to change yourself. The Stoics often refer to, the importance of the three main disciplines being perspective, action, and then will, that innate will to kind of keep going and doing something. So, you have to get a perspective on your life in order to find a sense of purpose and meaning. And your perspective will shape your expectations. And all of a sudden, when you read a book like that, it puts a sense of going, man, the storm is the same for all. Everyone in Auschwitz at that time was going through the same thing. And yet there's some people that withered away and died, and some people that still kind of found a way through it, because they found a greater purpose than their circumstances. I think that, yeah, I think it's just a big part. Too many men get caught up in this idea that like life is just so miserable and it's so entrapping and it's this and it's that. It's like, yeah, but you have to take action on that. So that book is transformative, I think, for a lot of people.
Megan, if I could throw in there, well, one, riffing off of Jonathan and talking about men, once you're comfortable with yourself, taking on, habits, actions, hobbies that might be considered feminine. Like I do most of the cooking in our house and our family. The joke is that cooking is far too important to be left to women. And so it's not a woman's place in the kitchen. It's way too important to be left to women. So I love cooking. Well, I can. But at Megan, when I get men come in who have been browbeaten to death or they didn't have a positive male role model in their life, I don't talk to them ever about that, you're good enough and people love you. They probably don't. Young men, their life it's tough to be a young man because when you're a child, adolescent, teen, yes, people are pretty positively opposed to you, but you find when you're a young man, when you hit about 25, if you don't have a lot of things figured out, life shuts itself to you like a brass door. And so I talk to these young men about the masculine virtues because in the Latin, the term vir from virtue is men. So virtues is the way of men. Men have to develop virtues. There has to be expectations set to men on how to be a man. Not everything you do is manly. You can't just do whatever you want, be considered a good man. There's bad men and there's good men, right? So I have whiteboards and I have flip charts in my room and we write it up. We talk about the masculine virtues, honor, justice, fairness, strength, loyalty, things like that. And these men, we go through and we track, what are you best at? With the people who love you the most, what would they say you're the best at? Where do you lack? Where do you have to develop yourself? What challenging things can you do to do that? And the opportunity we have in our time is, as I looked this up last time, I think it was a CIA fact book, if you trust that organization, there's like $80 trillion of liquid capital sloshing about the earth at any one time. I mean, there's a lot of things frozen up in investments, but there's a ton of money, and money are just biosocial credits, right? A young man who wants to can go and claw out a tiny fractional percentage of that and make 6 figures, can create 7 figures. I mean, hell, I started a construction company 5 years ago. Within 3 years, we were doing like 1.2 million as a company. Wasn't profit, by God, but I was able to show my sons that by planning and execution, honor, reliability, and creating expertise, they have no reason to be broke or poor for the rest of their lives. I mean, my 2 teenagers just built a $20,000 deck. Just the 2 of them. It's gorgeous, right? You have to train men, young men, to be virtuous, to practice those virtues that are masculine. Anyway, proceed.
I'm going to give a plug to my good friend and mentor, Christian Conti, who is a psychologist. He's in Pennsylvania. I know Ryan's had him on the podcast. I've had him on my own podcast a couple of times, but he's got a wonderful book that everyone should read, not just for the psychotherapy professionals, but for anyone walking the earth. It's called Walking Through Anger, and it talks about yield theory and how to meet people where they are, see through their outward behavioral presentations, and it'll improve lots of communication and so forth and improve your own leadership. But he just came out with another book, and I'll put it on the screen. It's called Strong Mind, Strong Man, and the subtitle is The Blueprint for Mental Toughness, Self-Mastery, and Real Strength. It's a workbook, and it's going to be, I haven't looked at it, it just came out a week ago. I've been busy, but I trust Christian, and everything he produces is amazing. He's got a great YouTube channel, but that's one thing you could practically put. If you're a female therapist and you're dealing with young men, put something practical in front of them, like the Frankl book, Man's Search for Meaning, like Strong Mind, Strong Man. It's like, I don't know, it's like $12 on Amazon or something, and help them walk through this process like Jake's describing of anchoring themselves with values and beliefs that work for them. And we could get into a really cool rabbit hole discussion about psychodynamics and Jungian analytic psychology and how we manifest our masculinity or femininity, however we determine those things in certain ways. I think the key is to be able to, again, to meet them where they are and not where you think they should be or where they used to be or where they could be someday, but right where they are, and meet them there, and then pick them up and move them forward and shepherd them in a way that they're seeking guidance, right? And you don't have to be a dude to talk to a dude. I mean, if that were true, I could never counsel anybody who wasn't exactly like me, which is impossible because there isn't anybody exactly like me. So we have to be able to see through some of the outward behavioral presentations, the hyperactivity, the distraction, the avoidance, the guardedness, the shielding, the flat affect, and look to the soul of the individual who's sitting across from us and recognize that they have limitless potential, just like every other human being walking the earth. And then really find out what drives them and use that anchoring to help them continue driving themselves, because therapy isn't supposed to be forever either. I have a whole rant on why that's patently unethical. But Strong Mind, Strong Man, I'd recommend the workbook.
I'd like to piggyback off of that because my answer to the question is really very similar to what you were saying at the end there. When I was 4 years old, we went to a concert in the local synagogue, and I remember very vividly that when we walked into the concert hall, I felt the bass in my body. I felt it rumble in my body, and I thought that was the coolest thing that I was like, holy shit, what is happening right now? Like, I like this. I want more of this. Later that night, I was dancing. And I was dancing like a little kid dances, you just flail around. And they thought it was cute, so they put me on stage. I made it into the VHS that this group sent out, and we used to watch it all the time. And my brothers would just be, they'd make fun of me about it. And rightfully so, two older brothers, and they were like, oh, look at you dancing, you look so funny. And for a long time, I was I learned my lesson, right? You don't be that open, you don't be that free with this kind of stuff. But when I look throughout my entire life, and even till today, music has always been there. And it got sparked when I was 4 years old, and no matter what happened, it's always been there. And when I treat somebody like a teenager who's in this kind of phase, I consider it maybe along with mental health issues, but I consider it a phase. And the reason why I consider it a phase is because in our culture, you are the same as everybody else for 12 years of education. So every year you go with the same group of people, and there's 3 or 4 things which are valuable in that little bubble that you live in, and then you're ranked against those people, right? And the people in your grade, the best at sports, the smartest, the best looking, whatever, right? But then once you get out, then you start to find your own stuff, and kids in high school don't know that. They don't know that at a certain point you're going to actually redefine what's valuable, and then I tell them this, and they're always like, I don't want to be that, but I'm like, well, hopefully you will be. You will become a super giant dork about one thing, and that will make you happier than anything in the world. So in order to reach that point where you're reading a dictionary on a Saturday night and cross-referencing it with another dictionary, you have to follow the spark. When you see it, when you have the music rumble in your chest, just follow it a little bit and see what's there, and remove it from the fact that you're a sophomore in high school and that everybody's doing this and everybody thinks that and everything that. Remove it from that, because in a very short time from now, you're going to be entirely separate from that group and all the values that are associated with that group, and you'll be ahead of the game, because you'll be like, I'm already following my soul, and my soul is moving forward, and I'm just kind of riding this momentum. And I started it before a lot of other people even thought that it was a thing, because they were just going with whatever the group said was valuable.
I can drop a real quick one in there, which is, culturally speaking, we're really weak on rites of passage.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a male client that you're trying to help out there, can he find anything that's a rite of passage that he can join? And sometimes a rite of passage could be as simple as, hey, I'm going to join this cycling club or this weightlifting group of guys, and just, the small landmarks around that. And then but rites of passage and celebration around that, celebration of accomplishment in that. I think we need to do more of that. Absolutely. I've tried to do it through deer hunting with my boys. We have the videos of them. You get your first deer, and it's beautiful, because it's my father's still living, and he did the blood ceremony with the oak leaves on my cheeks when I took my first deer, and my father did the same thing for my sons. And so, I want to do more than that though. So, but any rites of passage like that, or even close to that, could be good.
What about therapy do you think is feminized in a way that turns off men? And how could we improve that for men?
I don't think men sitting down in a clinical environment, having a face-to-face conversation with normally a woman, is what most men want. I think men prefer group therapy. I think they like to speak to other men on their level, not in a sort of clinical environment. They like some sort of physical activity. So we talk about shoulder-to-shoulder time rather than face-to-face time. One of the initiatives I really enjoyed seeing coming from Australia, but now in England and America, men's sheds. I don't know if you know about it, but it's essentially as described. It's these various sheds all over the country, which are workshops, and they're for all men, but particularly older men. And men go to sheds and they build and fix things for local communities, and it gives men that sense of purpose and camaraderie and belonging and meaningfulness, and has the added benefit of they're fixing like often toys for children. And that's had a massive benefit to men's mental health. And I think that's what they want. Like I've really enjoyed in the past few years seeing like a renaissance of what's called social prescription charities. So instead of like giving someone a pill, like an antidepressant, a man will be sent on to a dog walking group or an allotment or a men's shed or like a breakfast club or whatever it is. Like it could even be like reenacting Roman battles or walking around a field with a metal detector looking for Roman coins. These are things that I think have therapeutic value towards a lot of men, and we should be investigating them more rather than just writing up like pharmacological prescriptions. So I'm not one to tell you what men want, but I do think group therapy and these physical activities are a great start in finding out what that might be.
It's Dr. Perin. There's a fantastic meme he shares every once in a while, and it's of Gandalf and Theoden. And it's basically, Theoden's, kind of like all down and depressed and lost and has, worm tongue whispering in his ear. It's a bad place. And here comes Gandalf in, just rolls in, this man of wisdom, and hands him a sword and tells him to swing it. Right? That cures everything. But it's so true of male psychology. It's you've got to get that fight back in the client. That's the thing I've learned with all of my male clients is that if you don't get that fight back in them, you're never going to make progress. Yes, there are wounds. Yes, there is vulnerability. Yes, there is the need to express the self. Yes, there is. But if you're not actively also working to imbue them with a sense of courage and adventure and fight, you're not going to make progress long term.
Yeah. How would you advise therapists when dealing with men? Like, it's a very feminized profession, and I feel like there's just a lot of just uncertainty and often cluelessness about how to deal with men. What advice would you give?
I've heard fantastic things throughout the years. I don't know. There's a couple things come to mind. Men like to be given things to do. Right. We need some sort of a sense of a process and a framework where we see ourselves moving towards a goal. And so if therapy is too self-reflective, if it's too just like looking into your past and your childhood and just trying to understand everything, that doesn't tend to be as helpful for men as, okay, what are the problems in front of you? What are the mindsets you're getting in now? And how can we workshop these things to get better? Where do you want to be? So an analogy I like to give the guys when we get into some of those, it was probably because as a child this thing happened to me. Imagine yourself waking up at the bottom of a pit and there's this like overturned Jeep and you don't remember anything. And you're looking up and you're, 50 feet down this pit. And you've got your hands, nothing immediately broken. And you're tasked with, how do I get out of this pit? Now, the knowing, like piecing together the backstory of how that Jeep got down there and how you were in that situation may have some useful clues for how to get out of the pit. But it's every bit as likely that knowing exactly how it happened wouldn't help you at all. And you're just faced with the task in front of you. And so what I would say to the therapist is maybe there might be a valuable in a shift in focus from digging deep into past patterns and more in like looking at what they're faced with in front of them and giving them the tools and the framework they need to do it.
I look practically, I don't think men are necessarily opposed to going deep. I just think they want to know, like, well, now what? Am I supposed to cry? Like, no. So I think it's helping men grow in their window of tolerance. And exactly, I think AA is just so pragmatic, but that's why it works, right? I mean, how many, is it hundreds of thousands of people have been helped at this point? Like, is it, I mean, it's a lot. And the reason why it works, because it's so pragmatic, and I think people connect to it. It's, you follow the steps and you get there and it works, right? But I think then it can just become about the sobriety. And I think that's where like doing the deeper work can be helpful as a good balance. And so, yeah, I think it has been feminized. I think a lot of that is just, there's just so many women in the therapy field. And I think, and the other thing too, is like a lot of the men that end up in therapy are pretty feminine as well. So I think there's like that. So not only is there like a low percentage of men in therapy, but a lot of them are feminine. And there's nothing wrong with being feminine, but it just doesn't help the masculinity side of things, you know? So then we end up talking about toxic masculinity and how toxic men are, but then there's no way to help them because there's no real masculinity out there. Everyone's feminized everything. So then they're just constantly being yelled at and scolded and saying that having any masculinity is bad. I just think we don't have a good sense of masculinity, what that means. And then I think that pushes men away from going into the field, and it pushes men away from going into therapy as clients as well. And so
another thing I would say, and this comes from, Adam Lane Smith?
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite quotes from him is that female depression is about feeling unloved, and male depression is about feeling powerless. And now you don't want the therapist to go, okay, well, how can we just give them a lot of affirmations? You are powerful. We all think you're powerful. That's not where feelings of power come from, being capable and being competent and having that sort of self-confidence as a man. It comes from going in life and succeeding in some level. And so if a man is going to train his son, he sees his son feeling like a puny, weakling in sports or something. What does a good father do? He doesn't just like sit and say, you're good enough. You're good enough. It's like, no, you and I are going to go out in the backyard and practice, and you're going to try to just catch the ball. And every little bit of success you have, we're going to celebrate. And every time you fail, you're going to know why you failed. And that kind of thing ends up building a man up. And so more of that, I think those two things are what immediately come to mind. And how to actually do it in a clinical practice, I don't know.
And I'll give you another. Here's a practical kind of intervention example that's connected to the current conversation we're having. And I don't know. I think y'all will agree with the intent of this. I feel like that a couple of you guys have expressed opinions kind of against this type of intervention, or suspicious at least of this type of intervention. But y'all know, like, kind of somatic awareness interventions. Have read about that, have heard about that. That's where you pay attention to your inner felt emotional experience, closely following some kind of stress stimuli, and then you do something physical to try to dispel it. Well, I have created materials for the school counselors that I support that provided them a word bank of somatic awareness vocabulary, and I encourage them to use it with male students, especially that they're having a hard time gaining traction with and dispelling those short-term episodes of distress that I talked about earlier, because men use words less. Men talk less ugh, and probably don't have as much emotional vocabulary. And from the Gottmans and other research on that. Yes, right. Yeah. And so, but when you're working with anybody, and just by virtue of males processing verbally at a lower intensity and frequency, other interventions may be helpful to them, or because of a lack of emotional vocabulary, other interventions may be helpful to them. And so I taught school counselors to use a somatic vocabulary and a tense release exercise along with that, especially with male students, and to talk with those male students in kind of masculine ways, like, hey, your emotions are kind of like fuel for your body that gets you to do stuff. And you can have good fuel and you can have bad fuel. And sometimes we've got to purify the fuel a little bit and clean up the system a little bit. And so we're just exercising a little bit of control physically. And part of that for me is I think the extra layer that makes it really effective is to highlight for them, okay, how profound was the effect of using that technique on this distress? short term. So I have them scale it like, okay, 1 to 10 scale, how intense was it before we did that activity versus after? And almost always there's opportunity for celebration to say, oh my gosh, you got your this feeling, this tightness in your chest to go from a 9 to a 2 on the scale. How powerful is it? And then I always tell them, did I do that? Or did you do that? I didn't do that. There's incredible power in attuning people to their ability to, even in the short term, regulate their own emotions. And I'm not telling them to change any belief about their ability to alter their emotions, but it's a learning experience to highlight for them, I am capable of exercising control over my emotions, and I've quantified it.
You're increasing metacognition, which is one of those universal
Absolutely.
variables across all therapies.
You know, one of the things that you consistently hear men who are suicidally depressed say, like the feeling of uselessness. I feel useless or worthless. And kind of it sounds like what you're saying is so much of this is connected to, can I do something productive, or can I feel some sense of like I'm meaningfully contributing? And kind of this, you know, stereotypical feminized therapy where it's just like, I'm going to kind of take off the armor and like show you my vulnerabilities and show you even more how worthless I am. It almost seems to be going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, I recently had to recarpet a small part of my flat, mainly because the dog shit all over it. And it took me all day, and it required a lot of swearing and grunting and a few injuries. But after I'd done it, the next few days walking over that little 2 or 3 square feet of carpet, I felt so good about myself, not just in immediately afterwards, but just I felt so great having achieved what seems to be a rather benign act. And I can see why a lot of people, not just men, but women too, but particularly men, do get a sense of happiness and well-being from being productive and seeing the products of that productivity. And I just think we should get on board with that. It's just sad that that sort of thing is often mocked. There was that meme a long time ago that would say, it would be like a photo of like men like reenacting a Roman battle, and it would say, "Oh, men would rather reenact Roman battles or pretend to go to war than go to therapy." Or no, there's one of some older men tinkering with some steam engines. Or men would rather build a steam engine and run it for free than go to therapy. Or men would rather start a band. Or men would rather go fly a kite. And I'm like, those things are in many ways therapeutic to those men. Like, you're missing the point. Like, if they're getting enjoyment and they're finishing these activities feeling better than how they felt when they started them, then is that not therapeutic? It certainly shouldn't be sneered at, and we should be championing them, and in many ways seeing those men enacting Battle of Agincourt as the pioneers of mental health. In many ways, that to be learnt from. And I think a sense of productivity and belonging, purpose is essential to men's mental health. And that's just something you just don't get when you sit in a clinical environment and just talk about your problems.
Empowerment. That's instead of, again, the beginning of the process of saying you're too dumb enough to do this yourself, so you need your therapist to do it. That's the message being shared right now.
I feel like just some of the language that you're using, empowerment, tools. I use the word tools a lot. Like, this is something for you to grab onto and take with you so that you can solve your own problems out there. I feel like a more feminized version of therapy that is still good and useful in certain circumstances is, let's just sit here and process with no necessarily goal in mind. Let's just kind of talk about our feelings. Sometimes that is necessary. I think that is one tool that you need. I think a lot of times men see that. I don't understand what our goal here. Why am I doing this? Why am I being vulnerable? I don't see what kind of outcome am I pursuing.
I appreciate how you frame that, because like when I teach my students, when your client asks you, what the hell are we doing here? That doesn't mean they're not applying themselves enough. It means that we've lost the space as a therapist. Like when you talk about building awareness, the language I use with clients is we've got to sift. I've got to sift through things. We've got to find like, where are the nuggets? Where are the real things? Because we're just dealing with a pile of just emotionally stuffed experiences. But you'll also hear me use words like, you've heard me say empower, but I use a lot about power and influence. I feel like those two words, power and influence, very important in how people are experiencing society right now, because people are feeling powerless.
I've seen a massive increase in men coming to me for therapy. Huge. You know, if we go back to 2019, I think it was. Don't quote me, I might get the year wrong. You know, my website, for example, was, you know, years ago, very, very, you know, stereotypically, come to therapy, talk about your emotions, express your feelings, all of that sort of stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that approach at all. It works for plenty of people, and that's fine. The problem is when we assume it should work for everybody. I read loads of literature, and actually the literature I read was kind of really supporting what I was slowly starting to do and how I was thinking. So I changed my website to come to therapy, tackle your problems, take control of your life. That's very different wording, words that link to what we might call archetypal masculinity. I saw a massive increase in boys and men coming to me for therapy. And I'm like, wow, this clearly works. And then in the therapy, using different language. So rather than saying things like, it's okay to, you know, so for example, if someone says, oh, coming to therapy makes me feel really weak and I'm vulnerable. Some might say that a traditional response perhaps could be, it's okay to feel weak. It's okay to be vulnerable. You know, whereas another response that might lean a little bit more towards archetypal masculinity could say, guess that's one way of looking at it. And I guess another way could be that you're here. It feels uncomfortable to be here. And even though it's uncomfortable, you're still here. You've still made that call. You're still going through this. And so even though you're doing something that feels uncomfortable, I guess that might take more strength. And maybe this is the start of you this early days of starting to take control and fix things. So it's very different language. But ultimately what you do is you kind of use elements of masculinity to reframe the boy or man's perception. And I find in many ways that absolutely works, and it can help engage them. It can help to see things differently, you know, different things for different people.
I went through very severe depression for a number of years, and I did a lot of affirmation therapy. Let's boost your self-esteem and do statements of self-worth and all this stuff. And I think it actually made things worse because it felt like I was lying to myself. Nothing helped me more than getting into the gym and starting to feel a little bit of power in myself.
Yep. It's so powerful. Like just in the sort of like playlists that, you know, I listen to when I'm working out is a lot of those like 80s songs where you have like men cheering other men on, like, you know, when they try to drive you down, you can take it. That don't shake you. When your back's against the wall, you're the thrill of the fight's got you standing tall, and it's just like building you up. And it's not, but none of that means anything if you're not actually pushing the weight while you're doing and feeling the power and seeing those numbers change.
I feel like a decent amount of therapy is feminized in a certain way that kind of naturally turns off men, but I don't think therapy in and of itself naturally does that. And I'm wondering how you rebrand or market better, because I feel like, you know, there's a big culture of self-improvement in men today. You know, how can you maximize at the gym or in your diet or this or that? You know, I mean, could you talk about, you know, emotions maxing, or like how do you rebrand this?
I'm going to ask you a question, Ryan. As a man, what is important to you?
You know, I would think things like career, dating, you know, family, you know, hobbies, things like that.
Okay. These are all externals to the self, right? So you offer to men the opportunity to improve in those areas. But in order to do so, you have to change what's happening in here first, right? We have to undo the bad habits you've built on the path to where you are, so that you can be more effective at the things that matter to you. And that's it. It is self-improvement. It is those things. It is finally healing the wounds with your father, right? As much as you can, so that you can be your own man, right? It is having a better relationship with your wife or your girlfriend, so that they have more respect for you. They love you more. You in reverse the same, you become closer. All the things that you know, that are like, most of the problems I hear when it comes specifically to relationships with men is communication problems, right? Like
And they're always really simple ones. Never complicated communication. It's always very simple, but it's that understanding why the other person needs to be heard in this way and how that in turn will help them to hear you better. But also that you as a guy, there's the trope of you as a man can't tell your kids or your wife that you're struggling because that'll make you look weak. And if they sense that you're weak, they're going to leave you, right? That's the constant trapping. So you keep doubling down. You keep doubling down. You don't tell anyone. Now you start drinking, right? Now you start staying out late at work instead of coming home because you're afraid to come home and deal with whatever's at home. And instead of just having a good, healthy, communicated relationship with your wife or your girlfriend, where you let them know what you need in order to succeed, you just hide. And eventually the problems become so big that you can't unpack it. And then it becomes catastrophe. And now you're alone.
So that's that old stereotype, that old joke about like women just want you to listen, men want to fix it right now.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's true. I don't know if it's universal across the planet, but I think it's true. And so I think most dudes would rather fix a car and not have to listen to people talk about their childhood than, like, maybe dudes are self-selecting out for that reason too. Because, like, personally, the thing I hate the most is listening to people talk. I'm an excellent diagnostician and a pretty good supervisor because I see complexity pretty straightforwardly and very quickly without much of a bias or a reaction. I don't care. I'm not very attached. And so because of that, I have different strengths, but I will never be a great therapist because I will never be interested in the story. I'm interested in the solution, right? And a lot of why people like therapy and get something out of therapy is because they're having a relationship where the story gets to unfold. Now, again, I'm very biased because of how I'm built differently, but I bet a lot of guys just don't want to sit and listen to people talk, right?
Interesting.
And so I bet that's a problem or a reason why.
Physical fitness is psychologically healing to men.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. It's, I saw a stat about like men who had committed suicide, and the most commonly used word by these men was the word useless, like feeling useless, and just doing anything to feel like I have like some useless. I mean, even if it's something that's like an artificially created task, like lifting a bench press or something, like I feel like I did something. Like, kind of like you were saying, like a woman needs to feel loved, like a man needs to feel like I'm good for something, that I accomplished something.
Yeah. No, absolutely true. And that's really part of what this book is about back here, because we're finding, I mean, again, those weights in the gym don't need to be lifted up. They're fine on the floor. The weight will be fine, as opposed to what our ancestors 200 years ago, those hay bales or whatever, did actually need to get in the barn. But even now that we have machines to do that for us, we find that we need to be doing things like that, or we're not okay. And the same thing is true about male-female relationships. Hey, physically, materially, you may be off where you can both earn 2 incomes and provide for everything you need, and things are provided for, but she doesn't feel like she can rest in your strength like she did, 200 years ago, if all you're doing is typing little keys and saying, okay, let's order takeout, right? So we need some of that for our own health with each other.
I interact with a lot of women in my sphere of the world that are feminists. And I like to say, if you want to work with a man, let's say under 40, there's a few names that you need to know. You need to know Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Andrew Huberman, Chris Williamson, like those 4, definitely, you need to know who those people are. And you get a lot of pushback of like, oh, that's, they're pushing toxic masculinity or this or that. And the reality is, if you don't like those people, the ones waiting right behind them are very ugly. Like, you are not, if you get these people to abandon them, you're not going to like who comes after that.
Yeah, fact, right? Like, if you think those guys are bad, who are the other ones? Who are the other ones that we can prop up? And there's always going to be guys waiting in the wings, that want to take those spots that are not quality men, that are not quality men that I want to associate with. I know tons of great people. My dad, great role model. Tons of coaches that I've had are great role models. But some of these people don't have large platforms on social media that garner a lot of attention. And nowadays, at the age we live in, that's what sort of makes you a role model, because that's how you're going to be seen to the most number of men around the world. And so they are good role models. They are good role models for young men. And yeah, but if you don't like them, who are the other ones that you would put in their place? If you have other options, great. I'm here for it. Like, let's talk about them. You know, Scott Galloway is another great role model. Arthur Brooks is another great role model. But these guys are older men. Outside of Chris Williamson, who's about around our age, in his 30s, all these other guys are 50s and 60s, because they've been around so long, they've had some time to figure out who they are and who they want to be and build their life. And so young men also can have a larger time frame for their life, a longer vision for who they can become. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow or by the time you're 21, but it can happen by the time you're 40. You kind of build something because you did consistent work over a long period of time. You have to be able to sink your teeth into something meaningful and wake up, you know, hungry to just go out into the world and do that. Or if you don't have a path, you know, the world and social media is just going to flail you around and find that path for you. And it might not be the one that you really want.
Yeah, it feels like with men specifically, we're much more likely to want some tools to be able to use, some skills to apply to our life. I think if a man sees therapy, it's like, well, I'm supposed to talk about my feelings and just feel better. That doesn't resonate as much. It's like, how can I apply this to my life? I need something really tangible, I feel like.
Or even if you're explaining that, like, depending on what it is. So like, let's say somebody has an anger issue and they just snap. And this could, you know, that can be a big issue, because you can get fired. You can lose your job or your reputation. It can lead to a divorce or problems with your family. Like, that can be a pretty destructive thing. So how do you respond to it? Well, just explaining on some level that, like, it's really helpful to, in the moment when you're angry, to think about what's the trigger here. And a lot of times it's like you feel disrespected, you feel ignored, you feel not heard. Whatever it is, being able to connect to the feeling that's driving the anger can actually diffuse the anger a little bit. And the ability to reflect on it can slow the process down a little. So even if you need to take 10, you need to take 5, and you need to cool off, you can have that process of being like, I'm frustrated because I felt like what I was just being told felt really disrespectful, or I feel like there's nothing I can say to get me out of this, or I feel really shamed or judged, or whatever your triggers happen to be. Then you can speak about the actual issue in a constructive way and address the problem, rather than just exploding. And then the problem doesn't get resolved and you end up getting a high cost. So it doesn't necessarily have to be skills only for men. It could be insight-oriented, emotional, process-engaged work. But it does involve, I think, some type of explaining maybe a little bit more about how the process works and why it can be beneficial. The thing with the anger too is you can read all about this stuff, but like, really it is something that you have to practice. And so being able to, in a relationship, talk through that experience and reflect on it with somebody else and get another pair of eyes on it, and develop that habit of learning, practicing how to speak about that in a constructive way. What does that look like? Trying it doesn't go quite right. You try it again and you get some reflection on it. That's really indispensable for a lot of people.